Good afternoon and welcome. This is the workshop on strategies for combating opioid addiction, the opioid epidemic. I'd like to welcome you. My name is Dave Steingraber. I'm a senior policy advisor with the National Criminal Justice Association. And I want to note, by way of introduction, this is a very unique workshop because unlike any of the others at this forum, this represents the inaugural event between a partnership between NCJA and the Addiction Policy Forum, a partnership which we hope will be long and productive in translating the science of addiction to the criminal justice community. It's also unique because in addition to a capacity room, we are being live streamed to over 400 individuals who registered to see this, to observe this workshop via live stream technology. We're grateful to Connect to Share for their technology that's making this possible. Our format will be a moderated question and answer session. I'll introduce our panelists in a moment, and we will follow a format that will involve questions from me, but I assure you that we'll reserve some time at the end of this workshop for questions from the audience. So our topic today, the opioid epidemic, although some saw it coming, really rushed into the national consciousness within the last year. And it is one that I think has attracted a great deal of attention, and certainly, as is evidenced by the attendance at this workshop. We know the statistics. 129 people a day die from drug overdose. Admissions to prescription opiate treatment to prescription opiates has increased by 500%, and at least as of 2013, 22.7 million people needed substance abuse treatment, but only about 11% received it. It's captured the national attention because it truly is a nationwide epidemic. It seems to not be limited by boundaries of region, race, or income. And it has been a challenge to government because it crosses the traditional lines from the criminal justice community into the public health community. It has attracted attention in Washington, and because there was a grassroots movement to bring the concerns about opioid addiction to our congressional representatives, and you'll hear a little bit more from our panelists about legislation that's passed and signed into law. Our speakers today bring a varied perspective on the topic and our wealth of knowledge, expertise, and experience. So it's my pleasure to briefly introduce them. Full biographic information is included in your program material, but Jessica Nickel is the founding president of Brimley Group and executive director of the Addiction Policy Forum, NCJA's partner. Jessica's experience includes criminal justice policy and health policy, and has worked on a number of national issue-based campaigns and grassroots initiatives. Prior to starting the Brimley Group, Jessica served as the Director of Government Affairs for the Council of State Governments, where she worked on some very significant criminal justice legislation, including the Second Chance Act, the Mentally Ill Offender and Treatment Crime Reduction Act, and Justice Reinvestment Initiative. Jessica also worked for Senator Rob Portman when he was in the House and was appointed by President Bill Clinton to serve in the Drug-Free Communities Commission, excuse me. Next to Jessica is Pam Rodriguez. She is the president and CEO of TASK, Treatment Alternatives for Safe Communities, which is a statewide nonprofit organization in Illinois. Her perspective is not only that of managing a statewide program that serves nearly 30,000 people annually, but also has been recognized as a national voice on issues related to the opioid epidemic. John Blodgett is in his fourth term as District Attorney of Essex County, Massachusetts. When he first took office in January of 2003, he became a leader in confronting a range of issues, and I think what we'll hear today is his efforts to depart from perhaps what we would consider to be the traditional role of the prosecutor to one of a more activist role in combating serious community problems. He's instituted drug diversion programs and expanded juvenile and youthful diversion programs throughout the county, and several of which you're going to hear more about today. Finally, Jim Pugel is the Chief Deputy of the King County, Washington Sheriff's Office. Jim oversees the department's operations, which includes patrol, criminal investigations, special operations, training, as well as other operational arms of that department. Jim started his career in law enforcement with the Seattle Police Department. He eventually served as interim chief before moving to the King County Sheriff's Department. He's been a key leader in promoting the Law Enforcement Assistance Diversion Program, LEAD, which you'll hear more about when Jim makes his presentation. Jim serves on the Kennedy School of Government Executive Session faculty, Community Corrections, and the Vera Institute's advisory panel on justice reform for healthy communities. So those are our panelists. I'm going to ask each of them to make some brief introductory remarks, and then we'll proceed with more of a question and answer format. So, Jessica, your role has been in promoting a comprehensive approach and the public policy to support that approach for preventing and treating addiction across the criminal justice and public health system. So tell us a little bit about what you consider to be the key elements of a comprehensive approach. Mic on.
Thank you.
There you go.
So the process of working on the federal legislation known as CARA, Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act, that the president just signed into law a few weeks ago, that came out of sort of 3 years of a combination of things, bringing all of the stakeholders together to help determine what does a comprehensive response truly look like. So you had practitioners, researchers, family members, policymakers, all around one table from all of the fields that need to be involved to adequately address this issue, addiction. So law enforcement, criminal justice, prevention, treatment, recovery, all in one room around one table with one common goal. And through that process, which I know this came on, and felt like CARA came on really fast and was signed into law and passed very quickly, that work started almost 4 years ago. So through that 4-year process of really combining the evidence and what the science was saying with what the practitioners were contributing and what we were hearing from communities and jurisdictions, and you all, so many folks that are here today, have played an important role in this, we were able to identify what that comprehensive response looks like. And there are 6 key elements that is in CARA. And one of the really significant things about this legislation is not just the money, not just the new grant programs, but also that framework that is now in policy that can help guide states, localities, nonprofits, anyone who's really working to bring pieces together to address addiction issues. And remember, CARA goes beyond opioids. This is about all substance use disorders. So those 6 elements are prevention, treatment, recovery support, overdose reversal, law enforcement strategies, and criminal justice reform. Now, in each of those 6 elements, you can dive down even further. And I'm really excited about the partnership with NCJA, APF and NCJA coming together. Passing CARA and getting the ball rolling on the policy side and the funding side is just really step 1. Now we need to not only see those dollars in real life come to life, but have the policy and the programs that we can lift up to sort of follow each of those lanes. So in the criminal justice and law enforcement, 2 elements of that 6. And the other premise that is so important is that communities need to be doing all of these elements. One piece of this alone is not going to really adequately push back on an epidemic. And as David mentioned, we are losing 129 people a day. It's like a commuter plane crashing every day. All of you are sort of under the pressure and showed up today, so you know sort of how underwater so many communities are. So by laying out this comprehensive framework and then through our translation series, really trying to dive down into what's working, what isn't, what does the science say, what does the evidence say, how do we help you use the dollars and implement the next steps in each of these 6 lanes. So on the CJ side, criminal justice and law enforcement, one of the really cool parts of this comprehensive framework, or CARA, is a focus on pre-booking and pre-arrest diversion, and arrest as well as prosecutor-led diversion efforts. Earlier in the system, intercepting individuals with substance use disorders at earlier points as they have contact with criminal justice. So we're so excited that we have Pam here to give you more information about the data and what we know about earlier diversion options. and then the district attorney and Chief Pugil to really talk to you about two really promising strategies that are happening in communities that can be replicated and have had great success. This is the beginning of really looking at this and translating in each of these lanes, and this is one lane within one of those 6 key elements, and there's a lot more to come. But I think it's the combination of the policy change, the framework, and then connecting you with what the evidence and the real life practices, promising strategies, and practitioners that I think can really help us lead to real significant change and turning the tide on this.
Thank you. That's a great segue. Make sure the mic is turned on. I think it might not. Oh, there it is. It is. Okay. Make sure you get it close enough to. That was a great segue. Pam, TASC has been involved in both studying diversion and implementing programs nationally and certainly in the state of Illinois. Tell us a little more about diversion as you see it from the perspective of your background.
So, about a little over 2 years ago, about 2.5 years ago, we released a national report on the state of diversion in the United States. It was a survey, a top-level, high-level scan of what was happening in the environment. And we did that because of our work on the ground, knowing that things were happening, but also knowing that there wasn't a lot of consistency or communication between different kinds of diversion efforts. And so what we found, well, first of all, we defined diversion very narrowly for the purpose of this report, consistent with what Jessica was mentioning earlier and what my colleagues will be talking about. And that is that diversion at this point in the system is a diversion that often enables people the opportunity to avoid any kind of criminal conviction and all of the attendant consequences associated with that. You are probably very familiar with a lot of the other activities that are alternatives to incarceration. Those diversion activities often involve a plea. Jail diversion focuses on diverting mentally ill folks from the jail, but does it on a pretrial basis, but doesn't necessarily avoid conviction. We wanted to narrow the focus for this national survey to those things that helped people avoid convictions, given what we've learned about the consequences, the really lifetime consequences of that. And so what we did find was that there was a lot going on, and had been going on for many years. All across the country, people are diverting folks at the front end with low-level drug offenses, low-level property offenses, even some prostitution offenses and things like that. What we also found was that they were very invested in those things, had been going on. Really, diversion was a conversation that happened in the 70s, right? So some of those things had been going on that long. Now, what you might think if someone was doing something for that many years is that they would have collected a lot of data on that and know the effectiveness and know what the impact has been. That you would be wrong about. That people were invested in the programs, but there's not a lot of standardization, there's not a lot of clarity in definition, not a lot of clarity in performance metrics and things like that. So that was sort of one of the big findings that came from that report. With the growing interest in diversion, right, and the growing interest in deflecting people from the justice system, we identified a few issues, and we'll be continuing to emphasize those and do things like white papers and issue briefs on them that focus people's attention on developing a standard language for diversion, developing some standard metrics for diversion, focusing on some key issues of concern like potentially net widening. In other words, bringing people into the system to sort of get care when perhaps they would be just better deflected and dealt with in a public health setting. Disproportionate impact on communities of color, and those issues, who's getting deflected, who's getting diverted, and who's getting prosecuted. How are those decisions made? And so there are a variety of issues that we need to look at in order to take diversion to the next generation. But we should also really recognize and appreciate there's sort of been diversion going on for many, many years. Then there's the newer diversion generation. And I believe out of this opioid epidemic and out of some of the work of CARA, we have the opportunity to really elevate and advance the conversation.
Thanks, Pam. John, most of us that have worked in the criminal justice system have a pretty traditional view of what the role of the prosecutor is. You've clearly moved beyond that in terms of addressing critical community issues. Tell us a little bit about how you came to that methodology of serving your community.
Sure, but I think at the outset, being a district attorney from Boston, I have to let everybody know that Tom Brady is innocent. He didn't do it. You notice to my right is a man from Seattle, so his reaction is understandable. This is a serious issue, obviously. And what happened for me was when I was elected district attorney and took the oath of office in 2003, one of the first things I did was to meet with the 34 police chiefs in the cities and towns in my jurisdiction. Essex County in Massachusetts goes from the tip of Boston to the New Hampshire border, all on the seacoast. I have some very urban, gritty cities. I have idyllic seaside communities, so it's a complete mix in terms of my population and the demographics. But what struck me was almost every single police chief said to me that heroin was back, and it was back big time. So I thought about what would I do when I'm taking a snapshot of my community and the people I represent. What could I do to help combat that? And at first you sort of have a feeling of hopelessness, because I knew of kids from good families, kids who were going to have great futures, who were suffering from the disease of addiction, and it was like, how did this happen? Because it didn't meld with the mindset I think we all knew back in the 70s of somebody in the back alley with the needle sticking out of their arm. It was coming across all the demographics, and we know that now. So I took I have a very, very, I think, robust juvenile diversion program and youthful diversion, and using that as the model, I was able to get a grant from the Massachusetts Department of Public Health, which frankly was just a chance encounter I had with a legislator in Beacon Hill in Boston outside the State House who said, would you be willing to do this? Would you be willing to sort of take the risk of doing actual drug diversion? And I said, of course I would, if it makes for a better community. So I modeled it after my diversion programs in the juvenile side and the youthful side in court, and received a grant from the Department of Public Health in Massachusetts. I immediately returned the grant to the department because the grant was made out for my office to administer this program. And I said to the Secretary of Public Health, we're lawyers, we're not clinicians. You need to rewrite this. I'll gladly use this to create a drug diversion program, but the clinicians have to have the major say in terms of the treatment. I mean, that's obvious. So since that time, we've had a drug diversion program which I think is successful but can always become better. I've had 680 people go through it. Our success rate's about 60%, not good enough, but people in the field will tell you that's not a bad percentage for people who are suffering from the disease. As time has gone on, Dave, what I've realized is this is an evolving process for us. I have 8 district courts in my community of 800,000 people. I just implemented it in the last district court last year in a community called Lawrence. And the average intake in this district court in Lawrence is about 3 hours many times. So I have the clinicians who are determining the programmatic side, which is key, and then I have the people from my office helping to make sure that gets implemented. And what's the challenge in that? What's important is that when you realize how many people who are suffering from the disease of addiction have mental health issues, you realize how difficult it is, I think, to dovetail the right program that you want to have, that you have to make sure that at the beginning, to the extent you can, to the extent possible, the treatment takes into account the mental health issues. The clinicians who run my program will take people, because we all know that relapse is part of sobriety, but they'll take the person, the client that we're servicing, model that particular treatment to the needs of that person. It could be anywhere from a lockdown facility to daily interaction. Leave that up to the clinicians. What I'm most proud about in that respect is that we will take people pre-complaint, pre-arraignment. In other words, people before they're even stepping foot in a courtroom, will be given the option, when it's applicable, when it's appropriate, to go through drug diversion in lieu of prosecution. It's explained to those people it's going to be difficult, it's not going to be easy, but if you're willing to do the hard work, if you're willing to do this, we'll give you the chance not to be prosecuted in the criminal justice system in Essex County, Massachusetts. The other component for me that's most important is that the average the average diversion program is 6 months. That's important. For those of you that I'm looking at in the audience, you understand that 6 months isn't enough, but you have to have at least 6 months, as the clinicians tell me, to help that person hopefully start in the right road to recovery. I've had one person in for over a year. So it's not a fast trick gimmick by any means. And when people relapse, they're given the opportunity to stay in the program. Some opt out, but if you want to stay in the program, the clinicians will reboot your treatment. Again, as lawyers, we stand back, we stay out of it. You complete the program successfully, we're notified by the clinicians, the criminal complaint goes away. You don't have a criminal record. In some cases, you don't even go into court based upon your successful completion of the program. It's a start. It's constantly evolving, but it's a start.
Thanks, John. Jim, just as there's been a traditional view of the role of the prosecutor, there certainly is a traditional view of the role of law enforcement in terms of combating community problems. I want to say you're a leader in developing LEAD. You've been critical in the development of the LEAD program, which is really designed to kind of change the perception of nonviolent offenders and the law enforcement officers. Tell us a little bit how that dynamic has changed and how that all came about in your jurisdiction.
Well, it came about when I was hired into law enforcement in 1983. The rule was if you had drugs, if you used drugs, if you sold drugs, you went to jail. The jailer brought you to the prosecutor filed, the judge convicted, the jailer jailed, and they got out. And for the most part, they repeated it over and over. And we, the police, the prosecutors, the judges, repeated our role over and over. And it was very, very silo-based around the nation, and certainly from my experience and observation, certainly in Seattle. That led to a lot of wasteful prosecutions, a lot of paperwork by police, a lot of storage of evidence. All of that cost money. And we were not seeing a different outcome. And as Einstein once said, if you engaged in the same action over and over, expecting a different outcome, then that's insanity. A different side effect of this was significant racial disproportionality. The Seattle-King County area has about 3.5 million people in it. About 7 to 8% are African American. While our most of the focus for the arrests were on street-level drug use, and the arrest rates were about 67 to 71% African American men. So that was hugely out of proportion. That drew the attention of several civil society groups, including the ACLU and a local group called the Racial Disparity Project. And they began bringing legal actions against me personally, against the chief who was then Chief Kurlikowski, who went on to become the drug czar of OMDCP. And as well as the prosecutor, which was unusual because usually groups will go after the police to effect change in law enforcement. But they actually went against the prosecutor for disparate prosecution and selective enforcement, which was very unique. So this went on for years, and we were still engaged in our arrests, and the defenders and the ACLU were still engaged in the defense of those that were arrested. Finally, a defender named Lisa Dugard sat down with a very inspired captain one evening in between a deposition, and the captain asked her, what would you do if you were getting yelled at for all this disorder, drug-related disorder on the street? What would you do? And Lisa honestly said, I don't know. And that's how LEAD got started. Basically, and I'll keep this short because you guys will hear more about it later, but it's a pre-arrest diversion program. In 33 years of police work, it's truly the only true community policing initiative that I've been involved in. Many times a police chief will buy a bicycle and put cops on bikes and say that's my community policing. Or they'll take a police officer who is injured and can't do police work, and he'll have him go to community meetings, and they'll call that community policing. But this actually involved civil society groups. It involved the prosecutors, the mayor's office, the councils, the county executive, the Department of Corrections from the state, certainly the sheriff's office and the police office. And it was a consensus-based approach that at any one time, anyone could walk and still can walk from the initiative. It has 4 core principles. One is, of course, pre-arrest diversion. The person, if amenable and non-violent or non-predatory, can be immediately diverted to a case management worker. And that means immediate. We don't give them a card and say, hey, come back next week at 8 o'clock to this office. The case manager responds to the police department and does an initial assessment. If that person completes a thorough assessment, which includes them helping create their recovery and case management plan, then the prosecutor will not file that charge. End of story. So they don't even go to jail that night unless there is a co-occurring warrant or some other offense that they had been involved in. Another core principle is non-displacement. We know that there's a severe backlog of housing needs, psychosocial needs, addiction needs, education needs. This LEAD program addresses all those assets based on what the case management plan that the user or the consumer was involved with. But we built capacity ahead of initiating through significant funding from the Ford Foundation and Open Society Foundation, so that we had the capacity when the switch was turned on, not only to care for the LEAD participants, but to ensure that we did not displace people who were just getting to the front of the line. The last one of the core components is harm reduction. It's very unusual. I'd always been told that harm reduction is code for legalization. I've come to learn more about it, but this is a harm reduction-oriented model where you do not have to abstain to participate in the program. In fact, we all know that it took 15 to 30 years for these street-level, nonviolent users and consumers to be involved, and you can't cure them, certainly by a night in jail. And as Jonathan even said, not even sometimes 6 months. We've had participants in LEAD who have been going for 16 months to 2 years. But they're getting better, they're using less, and there's a heck of a lot less harm reduction witnessed by the community members who own businesses or condominiums or other items in the target area where we initiated LEAD. The community is saying there's significantly less harm in the area where you have initiated this. I will leave it at that and give it back to you.
We'll be back. Thank you. We have a feel for the wide range of experience and perspectives represented by our panel. Let me start to examine some of the elements a little bit more closely. Pam, we know that diversion is more than just simply keeping people out of prison, and it requires that there be services provided, much needed services provided. It's not just a matter of keeping the numbers down. Tell us a little bit. Now, none of us have the resources we wish we had to implement programs like this. So tell us a little bit about what you think the priority services are, that the best steps that a community could take in lean budget times to kind of make a program like this work. Because I'd have to add as a footnote, there's nothing worse than a great program that fails because you just don't put the resources behind it. So.
Sure. So I would say that there are basically 3 things to think about. And you actually heard them sort of mentioned by our previous speakers. The first thing I would focus on, since the population we're talking about has both substance use and mental health disorders, is access to investment in behavioral health services for the population we're targeting. If you are in an expansion state or a state that has Medicaid coverage for substance use and mental health treatment services, that's a much easier lift, right? Because there's a lot of federal money to support that. But if we do a basic risk needs assessment on the people that we're talking about, you're going to find substance use and mental health disorders at the very top of the list. And so failing to address those issues would be a huge mistake. And to the extent that you're able, they should be comprehensive. You need to have the entire continuum of detox and some level of residential, as well as outpatient, intensive outpatient, and recovery supports for long-term participation in the program and long-term recovery, to support long-term recovery. You also heard mentioned case management and case managers. It's often a service that is given inadequate attention or perhaps respect. But one of the biggest challenges our folks face is navigating really complicated systems, complicated substance abuse and mental health treatment systems, complicated benefit systems, complicated housing systems, complicated justice systems, right? And so case managers who have knowledge and expertise in recovery, in accessing care, in navigating systems, and being advocates for the people that we're talking about is a really affordable support service for the population that we're talking about, and really works to help keep them in care and remove barriers to care. So behavioral health treatment, case management, and if you have money, housing, right? So long-term, our folks are often periodically homeless or marginally housed, unstably housed, or housed in dangerous situations. And so having access to transitional housing environments, if some folks need permanent supportive housing, that's sort of the big, deeper end of housing and a little bit more costly, but again, it's supported by federal dollars and service money, so you can cobble together a funding stream to support that. But I would say substance abuse and mental health treatment, case management, and housing are the critical services to focus on.
Thanks, Pam. My next question goes to both Jim and John. You've both spoken of how you've kind of changed the traditional view of your organization's response to this problem. It's one thing for the justice entity to come around to it. Let's talk a little bit about how the community has evolved in terms of accepting that approach, and what kind of community engagement you had to employ to kind of get the buy-in, so that DAs are, I presume, elected in Massachusetts like they are across the state. The police are certainly accountable to the public in a number of venues. Talk a little bit about how you kind of bring the public along with a new strategy to combat the opioid epidemic. Either one of you can start.
Okay, as I said earlier in my opening, and in fact, Malcolm Sparrow from Harvard has a very good book that he just published called Unhandcuffing the Police. And it talks about how in the 80s, the definition of problem-oriented policing or neighborhood policing was set, and the roadmap was there, but it was not done properly. And one of the improper things was it never really involved the community. The police chief would go to a conference, or the mayor or the president of the city council would go to a conference like this, hear about a neat program in some other part of the nation or the world, and come home and say, let's do this. Let's put this solution on the community's problem. But they never really engaged the community. What has really helped sustain lead in Seattle and King County is the community was at the table from the very beginning. They had not only been complaining about the open-air drug markets and the disorder, the defecation, the urination in doorways, the sleeping, the litter that goes along with it, but they were also going, why don't you guys try something else? All you do is go out there and buy drugs and arrest a person, put them in jail, and they're out here all over again. So we really got them involved at the very beginning. And like any other community council or community, they evolve and new people move in. The people who are familiar with the issue move out. So it's a continual education of not only the community, but also of the newly elected city council person or the mayor or the newly appointed police chief or sheriff. This started in 2011. The planning and incubation of it was about 2010. And a significant reason why it has sustained itself is for two reasons. One is no individual agency or organization could take credit for it. They could not say, elect me because I did LEAD, or donate money to the ACLU because we created LEAD. Everyone created it. And when we get new folks, either in the neighborhood, in the head of the community council, or a new mayor or city police chief, they may come along and think that they have a better idea. Well, they may, but they're going to have to put it through the policy-making lead committee that is all consensual based, and it has to go through there first if you want to tweak it or adjust it. It doesn't mean it can't evolve, but once you take the power away from the people and just have it top-down driven, then it's not going to succeed, and you will not have the investment from the community.
Great. John?
The communities that I represent were thirsting for more information on issues involving their children. And it's not something that is a traditional role of a district attorney, but one that I think my fellow district attorneys and I sort of embraced. And by way of example, I always try to find out what's happening in the community and then dovetail my resources, as limited as they are, to doing something proactive in terms of community-based. Underage drinking is a huge problem in my county. The consequence of underage drinking can be devastating. I've had 3 deaths of kids who died because of parties in which adults hosted and gave alcohol to the kids in clear violation of the law. So what I try to do is provide as much information as possible at different settings and different forums, schools, evenings, even a direct phone call, so that people, particularly kids, will make good decisions. But as I mentioned about my drug diversion program, it's always constantly evolving. Internet safety, we do a lot of work with that, trying to help kids understand the dangers of internet safety. The obviously, drug abuse, bullying. Everybody wanted to get information and knowledge about bullying programs. What are you doing about bullying? It sort of exploded nationwide a few years ago. But I also learned an awful lot by having members of my staff, 2 people in particular who were doing the community outreach, come back and tell me what was going on that I never would have anticipated. An example, I was totally blown away when I realized, and it got back to me, the extent of teenage domestic violence abuse, teen dating violence, excuse me. The scope of teen dating violence was amazing, and was further distressing by the fact that so many young women, and usually it's women, I won't say it's not men, but were victims of teen dating violence and accepting it as being the norm, accepting it as something that's normal, a special kind of love. So we did all we could do to combat that and go after that and make people understand that it's not okay to have somebody you're in a dating relationship with abuse you. It's not okay and should not be tolerated or accepted. So we do everything we can to reach out to the community. But again, I find the communities that I represent are thirsting for information and knowledge, and we dovetail as best we can different parts of my county how to handle that, because there's some different issues can pop up at different times. The other thing in terms of communicating with the communities that's important, and this was sort of an ancillary benefit of the diversion program that I've mentioned earlier today, was at a forum not unlike this, one of the superintendents in my schools that I represent had mentioned there were 243 kids in her city who were identified as coming from families suffering from the disease of opiate addiction. And it was like somebody punched me in the stomach when I heard that. 243 kids identified to date. And I just walked out of this meeting saying something has to be done. So met with the superintendent, who's fantastic, the police chief, who's very progressive, and the organization that I use for my drug diversion program is called Bridgewell in Massachusetts, and they're fantastic. And I said, we've been focusing so much on the people who are suffering from the disease of addiction, and that's important. But what about these kids? I mean, some of these kids have never had a good day their entire life, never had an easy day, never had any fun. So I was able to set up, as an ancillary effect of the diversion program, an after-school program that's 2 days a week. And I have the police who are part of it are trained to interact with the kids, but I have 2 counselors on session, and I have some of the people from the school system. The kids come after school 2 days a week. They're fed because they're going to school hungry. They're getting help with their homework. The counselors there are available for them once they're able to get to the point where we want to talk to them, and we try to do some things to make things fun for them. Some of these kids have truancy rates of 92%, but they're coming to the after-school program because they're starting to feel accepted. And there is no better feeling for me than to be sitting in the stands. This was started in January, in June, and having one of the teachers point out kids who when they first came reluctantly would sit down, they wouldn't make eye contact, they wouldn't talk to anybody. And now they're looking forward to coming, they're talking to the counselors, they're opening up. They still have to go home to a tough situation, but at least now they're getting a fighting chance. So that's one of the community-based offshoots, is Jim has mentioned, that I never would have anticipated being part of what I would do in my job. But I'm very proud of the fact that now we're trying to address, and I'd love to have this happen in the rest of my county, helping kids coming from those families cope to the extent that they can, or cope in order to help, again, at the risk of being redundant, giving them a fighting chance. But it's the community discussion and interaction that's so important for us that makes it possible.
You both clearly have very effective programs that with a strong community basis. Just in the interest of kind of full information, were there any types of community pushback that you had early in the process that we may want to alert people to as they embark on these sorts of non-traditional approaches? Any pushback from the community that we could anticipate and deal with early on?
Anytime there's change, there's going to be pushback to some extent. But I think if you explain yourself adequately, if you explain what you're trying to do and the ultimate goal, the community will embrace it. And I had a little bit of pushback on the diversion program, but now everybody embraces it. And what's good for me is it's been happening since 2007, so now defense attorneys rush to us and say, hey, I've got somebody I think should be eligible. Police officers do it, clerks in the court. So the pushback was minimal, and certainly the benefits outweighed the risk in terms of having anybody.
Can't quarrel with success, right? Jim, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and there's always different types of communities, whether political or geographic or racial or religious. Our 2 largest pushbacks initially were from the elected prosecutors and from the elected officials, and rightfully so. They are sworn, and in the public's perception, they're just the old perception, keep our neighborhoods safe by putting people in jail. Certainly not Jonathan, but there's a fair amount of prosecutors around the nation that still run by saying how many people I've put to death, how many people I've put in prison regardless of. And Jonathan knows, our prosecutor, his only fear was if one of these pre-arrest diversion people went free that night after they had secured or got their initial risk management intake, what if they went out and hurt someone? What if they raped or killed? That was the same thing for the elected city councils and the mayor and the county executive. So the ACLU, the Defender Association, the police chief, the elected sheriff, everyone in the policy working group, we swore on the Constitution and anything else worth anything, saying that if something goes wrong, and you get accused of going soft on crime, or you get accused of not prosecuting or not jailing, we will all stand with you and hold hands. On the converse, if it goes well, we all take credit for it. So again, back to the community, there was considerable concern, and that what led us to what the qualifiers would be to allow someone to participate in lead, which one of them was never being convicted or charged with a nonviolent or with a violent crime. That has been modified somewhat because of the success of the current lead participant. So the amount of permissible drugs that you can have has been increased. The type of crimes that you have been involved with have increased as well.
Interesting. I want to bring it back to Jessica for a moment. We've heard about two very successful locally based programs. Many of the people that attend this forum are state-level policymakers that would like to kind of create an environment at the state level that would support and encourage the development of programs such as this. Talk a little bit about what the state's role could be, particularly in light of the 6 elements that you spoke of earlier. How can the state incubate and promote that sort of environment that would favor the development of programs like this?
I think that there is, as Pam mentioned earlier, there's so many amazing programs and initiatives that are happening under the radar nationwide, both in diversion and alternatives to incarceration, but in every category along the 6 elements of a comprehensive response. So I think for state policymakers, sort of folks in the governor's office, I think if you follow the key principles and the evidence behind each of the issues that make this comprehensive response, so prevention, treatment, recovery, overdose reversal, availability of naloxone, and the programs that supply and provide that as an intervention point, criminal justice reform, and law enforcement strategies. There are all of the components that you need to take this, whether it's new resources or a focus within a state, and really expand new initiatives that are going to have a greater impact and be able to really turn the tide of this. One of our biggest problems in the addiction field, which is, like I said, it's so many fields combined into one, is the trouble translating what we know, both the science as well as the amazing programs that exist in our communities. And we have that, and this project and many more to follow. We're trying to get you the tools and the information to states and local jurisdictions so you can really replicate and follow the science and have new programs with better outcomes that you can tailor and make changes to fit the needs of your community. So all of the components are there, and now our hope with new federal resources that are coming out of CARA, the combination of the two can make for a bit of a sea change. Thank you. Pam, as you've kind of had both a national and a much closer perspective on what's happening in Illinois, can you talk a little bit about any experiences you had with people who have actually kind of come around or been converted to the notion of diversion as opposed to incarceration as a strategy, and just kind of where that revelation come from, and kind of, if not anecdotally, kind of just share some of your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm not going to name names. I actually want to sort of tie that to what Jim was saying and to the broader survey that we did and some of the conversations we had with people who were doing diversion. There are places where it's happening on a significant scale and it's known by the community, and the prosecutor, if he or she does not run for election on it, at least is not running from it, right? And there are places where people are doing diversion and they're more or less hiding it because it doesn't look or sound like they're being tough enough on crime. And then there are places who are afraid to try it for those same kind of reasons. And so I think even in answering Jessica's question at the state level, some things the state can do would also be to do what Jim said they did at the local level, and that is stand together, hold hands, and say, if it works, we're all taking credit. If it doesn't, we're all going to accept responsibility at the same podium in front of the same cameras and all of that. And the state can provide some support for that. So what I would love to say to you is, and I imagine there's 1 or 2 researchers in the room, I would love to say to you that research on program effectiveness drives change, but I would be lying. You need the research on program effectiveness. You absolutely have to have it. You need the data on cost effectiveness. You absolutely have to have that. But people really only come around through pain, right? They only come around to change because of either, personally being affected, their neighbors are affected, the community's affected, or it costs too much. And so our backs are against the wall because it's costing us a fortune, and we can't, build our way out of this. We can't incarcerate our way out of this. 600,000 people a year are going to come home from prison. What are we going to do? 129 people a day are dying from overdoses. What are we going to do? So it is that kind of data that creates some motivation in people to change. And then you come in at the ready as a partner with the research on program effectiveness, with the research on cost effectiveness, and create a strategy and a platform for change in a system. But unfortunately, it does take often it takes a tragedy, but it almost always takes something painful to get systems to change.
Interesting. Thank you.
And they do, by the way.
Yeah.
We have plenty of pain, so their systems do change.
I think there are few people in this room that don't appreciate the value of diversion as an alternative to incarceration, and obviously, as in many is the case with programs, the kind of devil's in the detail. And we've talked a little bit about some of the things, the follow-on services and the environment that needs to be in place. Let me go back to Jim for a minute and ask him to talk a little bit more about their program, because it's not an abstinence-based program, and I would speculate that might be something that you would get the most pushback on from the clinical community.
I don't know about the clinical, but certainly from the police community, including myself. As I said, police officers and more or less prosecutors are born to put people in jail. At least that's the way we thought we were trained in the academy, and all the statistics that you were measured by as a patrol officer or as a junior prosecutor was arrests and convictions. And certainly if you run for election, you're going to be looked at as how hard you were on crime. So harm reduction is the concept of meeting the person where they are and trying to work with them, knowing that they're engaged in high-risk behavior, that they're likely not going to be able to immediately disengage anytime soon. So how can you reduce the harm they're causing themselves and the harm they're causing their community? It took a while for me to explain it to my police commanders and certainly the police officers, but if you look at what good police officers have done in the past, in the last 150 years, any good neighborhood cop has practiced harm reduction. They will take the person who maybe should have gone to jail, but they brought him home to mom and dad and documented it and let them take care of it at home. Excuse me, with police, we're engaged in high-risk behavior on a regular basis, and the metaphor I use with them is, for years, in fact still now, more police officers die from auto collisions and being hit by cars than any other means of lethal force. So that's why we made cars with airbags, and we made mandatory wearing of seatbelts. So even though the police are engaged in harmful behavior, driving above the speed limit, going against red lights, to do their job, we've significantly reduced the harm they bring to themselves and to the damage of equipment and so forth. Again, with bulletproof vests, until about the mid-'80s, the wearing of bulletproof vests did not really happen that often. When we made it mandatory in most police agencies, because police, again, are engaged in high-risk behavior that they're likely not to be able to disengage unless they become a detective or a chief in the office. And then that's why we made mandatory wearing of vests essential. And, well, I could go on and on, but
okay.
The whole concept was very foreign, not only to me as a police officer, but the prosecutor, as well as some of the electeds.
At the risk of making this a point-counterpoint discussion, I want to turn to John, because it seems to me one of the aspects of your program is a commitment to maintain sobriety.
Well, abstinence is a key component. But as I said earlier this afternoon, if you relapse, you're not disqualified from being in the program. If you relapse and you're willing to stay in there, the clinicians will reboot your treatment. But abstinence certainly is a key component of the eligibility for the program. The other aspect I think that's important in terms of the word accountability. I mean, I am accountable. Jim had mentioned the elected prosecutor, a former prosecutor out in Seattle. In the criminal justice system in which we're trying to make changes, a lot of talk about reform, at least in Massachusetts, judges are appointed. They're answerable really to nobody. The defense bar is not answerable to anybody, but it's the prosecutor who has to face the community. And the prosecutor has to make the case as to why he or she's done the job. And I think that's good. I think that's important. So I'm certainly willing to take the risk or get up and talk about how I think it's helped the community to do certain programs. But we are the only player in the entire system that's accountable to somebody, and we are every 4 years. I'm a big believer in drug court. I mean, diversion is something I'm committed to and always will be. But I think drug courts are critical because for those who did not avail themselves of diversion, either by choice or by circumstances of fate, drug court gives that person the opportunity to perhaps save his or her life. And I go to the drug court graduations in my county every year, and every year the graduating speaker who's chosen by his or her peers says the same thing. And last year there was the young lady who was the program chosen by her peers said, "Look, drug court was the last house on the left, and if I didn't avail myself of drug court, I'd be dead today." And that's a fact. So it's obvious that when we talk about innovation, we talk about change in the criminal justice system, diversion's critical and important, and will continue to expand. We'll continue to have more of a role, but you have to have, I suggest, drug courts for accountability, and also to help those persons who just didn't, again, avail themselves of diversion and needed that to save their lives. So,
thank you. One of the elements of this partnership is this whole notion of translating science into action for the criminal justice system. So I want to turn to either or both of our remaining panelists to kind of reflect on this particular issue in terms of the science and translating it to action for programs such as this.
Okay. Well, actually, I would, in my previous question, I was asked about people using research and data to change practice, and I think drug courts are a really good example of that. People having researched them, having proven their effectiveness, their cost effectiveness, their impact on people's lives and the justice system, and having then expanded them as a result of that. So I think they're a really good example of that. But there are some barriers to translating research to practice. If you haven't heard the statistic that it takes 16 years to get research into practice, let me be the first to tell you, based on other research, it takes 16 years for research to get to practice, at least in the healthcare environment. And I can't imagine that, in behavioral health or the justice system, we're a whole lot faster than that, given that medical folks have coaches with them all the time on how to integrate and implement up-to-date evidence. So it's a huge challenge. Why is it a big challenge? There are, I think, a few reasons. One is that we tend to avoid new information that doesn't confirm what we already believe, right? So we sort of ignore some of the new research and ignore some of the new ideas and some of the new practices, et cetera, just by our very nature as human beings. And systems are built to ignore new evidence. Bureaucracies are built to stay the same and do the same thing. And so I think there's just an innate resistance to implementing something new. I think there's a lot of investment in infrastructure surrounding the status quo, right? Things are organized a certain way, whether it's the community policing strategies infrastructure, whether it's the behavioral health treatment strategy infrastructure, whatever it is, there's a lot of investment already in the status quo. And so financial investment, buildings, people. So it's really hard to change and realign and repurpose all of that. Those are big barriers to implementation. And then ideology, I think, is sort of the third thing that gets in the way. And with regard to that, I'm going to go to the harm reduction conversation from a few minutes ago and talk about the fact that in the substance use treatment world, the notion of gradually engaging people in services who continue to use is pretty challenging, right? That's pretty challenging. It's also pretty challenging to integrate medication-assisted treatment in an abstinence-oriented philosophy and abstinence-oriented treatment regimen and in an infrastructure built around abstinence, right? So you need doctors, you need nurses, you need a whole different kind of group of professionals to help deal with integrating that new practice into your system. But one of the biggest barriers are the attitudes and values and beliefs of the people providing the services. And so the lead notion where we take people where they're at and we keep them engaged as long as we need to for them to begin a path to recovery is different than the sort of medical model of come in, get detoxed, go to treatment, here's your prescription, see you in, for your checkup in 6 weeks or something like that. So just changing our attitudes and values is very difficult, as well as changing our infrastructure. With those being said as the barriers, the strategy to address them is pretty obvious too, right? How do you repurpose and realign your infrastructure to support new evidence-based practices? How do you repurpose your investments in buildings, et cetera? How do you confront challenges with ideology? How do you use the evidence and the research to help people learn? All of those are things that you're going to have to do to actually integrate and overcome some of the barriers related to translating science into practice. I know everybody probably thought I was going to say money, right? You need to invest lots of money in order to change, and maybe sometimes you do. But that is, in my opinion, sort of like the last barrier. I think we need to get over these other barriers first, and we'll figure out the financing and the investment once we have the leadership and the model agreed to by the community, by the providers, and by the clients who need the services.
Great, thank you. Jessica, some thoughts perhaps from a policy perspective on implementing science?
I just agree with everything Pam just said. I think sort of just piggybacking on that, a lot of the shifts that we can see in implementing new strategies, and whether it's lead models or prosecutor-led diversion, which I don't actually, from my perspective, I don't see them very far apart. And I also encourage folks to not get entrenched in the necessarily abstinence or I think we need to look at this as a disease, and we need to treat it as such. And there might be some nuances and some old ideologies and old thinking that we need to shrug off. But if you're consistently focusing on addiction as substance use disorders as a chronic illness and follow it as such, all of these things sort of come into line a little bit easier. I think it helps explain why there's new approaches, there's new innovations, whether someone has heart disease or diabetes or asthma, that they should be looked at as needing care for the long term. There will be setbacks. There are ways that other interventions are going to be needed based on that patient population. And you're looking at a lot of interaction with this group of people who have a chronic illness in criminal justice populations, and those thinkings, and we've already, and the changing that we're seeing happen in a national scale. Congress just enacted pretty sweeping legislation. It's almost $1 billion over 5 years. It treats addiction like a disease. The main criminal justice component in this bill is not a new mandatory minimum. It is a pre-booking alternative to incarceration program that we're looking to see over $30 million invested in this next fiscal year to be used for that purpose. It puts naloxone on the streets to make sure we have adequate overdose reversal. It expands evidence-based medication-assisted treatment and other treatment modalities. It includes prevention and enhanced recovery supports. It has veterans programs, women's. So every component of this 190-page bill is looking at this through a disease lens. And the changes that you need to see within your systems, that thinking change is going to help you as well to get people there. And the other reality is we're sort of at epidemic scale at the sort of the national level, 129 people a day. If you factor in alcohol, that number shoots to way over 300 people we're losing on a daily basis. It also means there's no one in this room who does not know someone who is suffering from alcoholism or drug addiction, whether it's neighbors, it's in your workplace, your own family, or your community. We all have been touched by this in some way. That goes to our policymakers, our folks at home that we need to really get to focus on this in a real way to make change and implement new thinking. They all have been impacted in some way, and we can combine and leverage that unfortunate, painful experience to get them to see that there are better paths forward that follow the evidence, that follow the science. It needs to have some shifting of that old thinking, but there are great programs like these two here, LEAD and District Attorney Blodgett's program, that can be replicated, that can be used and held up, and get people to get motivated and excited about a different way of doing business.
Thank you. You've headed down the path I want to go. I want to look a little forward. Look at the future. We've heard some really positive things, some encouraging things from this panel. When I asked them what their assessment is, whether we as a nation are now ready to kind of move forward on a more global basis to reform the justice system, at least with regard to how we respond to this sort of epidemic. And I think you've kind of started that answer for me, so you can follow up if you'd like, or we can see what the other panelists think about the future.
I can share the mic.
Yeah.
I absolutely think we are. I think we've seen evidence of it from passage of all kinds of different crime bills related to sentencing reductions, to the CARA Act, et cetera. But I said earlier that people really only change when they experience some pain. And there's something incredibly painful about, you quoted, you said over 300. What is it?
Alcohol, yep.
I mean, I think it's like 350.
So let's just, if it's 350 people a day dying from alcohol and other drugs, that is absolutely an epidemic. And that has to be motivation enough for all of us, regardless of whether we're elected, appointed, volunteers, personally affected, whatever, to mobilize, to sustain our focus on this issue. We are, as a body politic, notoriously easy to divert, and our attention drifts, but we have got to maintain focus on this issue. And if so, and we can reduce those numbers, that would be fantastic. But that is a motivating number. 300 to 350 people a day dying. It's horrible.
John, the path forward?
I think the path forward's already been traveled down. I mean, there's no question that it's not that change is in the air. Change has been happening. It's like Pam said earlier, everybody has a little piece of something. From my vantage point, I mean, I represent victims of crime. And I want to give everybody who is suffering, and in Massachusetts, we clearly understand the difference between somebody who's a drug user and someone who's a drug trafficker who's profiting at other people's expense. So we're beyond that, frankly. But the trick, from my perspective, is going to be how do you protect victims as well? You know, it's going to be, again, an evolving process. Somebody whose mother had her shoulder dislocated because somebody who's suffering from the disease knocked her down as he took her pocketbook. Or somebody who comes to my office outraged because the house was broken into and, things were stolen or messed up. I mean, that's the balancing act, frankly. We are going down that road. There is change. There is an awful lot of discussion about it. And I think it'll continue to do that. It's going to take time. I'm not going to repeat what Pam has said. She's right about the different, the interests that are sort of holding on or the status quo. But it will take time. And I think the most important thing, the last thing I'll leave you with, is I think it's really time to have an honest discussion about where we are. We can't make changes in the criminal justice system based on slogans and cliches. And for those people who do that, I say shame on you. There isn't one person that anybody here knows who's sitting in jail for 10 years for selling a bag of weed. Please. That is such nonsensical, and I hear it all the time, and I always say, well, tell me who, and of course that ends the conversation. But I think if we're really going to have serious change, in America with respect to these issues. We've got to get off slogans and cliches and the sort of thinking that I'm going to dig my heels in and that's it and nothing's going to happen. So for me, again, as a prosecutor, and I think I speak for all my fellow district attorneys in Massachusetts, we'll take the risk, we'll embrace the change, but we do have to represent people who are victims of crime and people who've committed crimes because of addiction. That has to be balanced and that has to have that accountability factor.
Jim, your thoughts on the future?
Thank you. On the future, I think there's two things. One is in general, and Jonathan and I had this discussion at lunch, and Jessica and I did last night at dinner. We have to expand the roles of a police officer, of a firefighter, of a prosecutor, of a defense. We cannot be siloed, and we cannot be entrenched in our one role. A good example of the intensive case management that goes on in LEAD, it takes a lot of time to find someone who is still using, not necessarily addicted, but using, find them housing. And there's been cases where the case manager has gotten a hold of the deputy prosecutor who manages all of these LEAD participants, and where the person has a warrant, it's a nonviolent warrant, it's for shoplift or something, and the prosecutor has asked the judge to quash the warrant and allow this person to start housing today, because if they go to jail, they're put to the bottom of the list and it'll be another 6 months. And that's actually going on. But that's gutsy for the Dan Satterberg, who is Jonathan's equivalent in King County, to do that. We have to look at, for the police, not necessarily looking forward, I think we have to look backwards a little bit. For your homework tonight, Google Sir Robert Peel's 9 Principles of Policing. And that was the foundation of the Metropolitan Police Department in 1832. And I guarantee you, if every police chief and police officer and deputy sheriff in the nation read those 9 principles every morning, we would not have the racial disparities of enforcement. We would not have these really bad ticketing initiatives, and we would have a much healthier neighborhood. So I would take a look at that tonight. So we have to look backwards to what really worked hundreds of years ago and really built a community instead of being, like they say, popular punitism. Everyone just wants to throw someone in jail and feel good about it.
Thanks, Jim. You've been a very attentive audience. I'd like to now turn to you to see if you have any particular questions or comments to be directed toward the panel. Yes, Al.
This is probably a Jim and John question. One of the factors that has been pointed out has been the overprescription of opioids and the degree to which we have just gone too far, either illicitly or illicitly. And to what extent can you and have you investigated those issues? And to what extent are you fundamentally prohibited from doing it because of inability to get access to that kind of information?
In Massachusetts, the Massachusetts State Police have a diversion program, not diversion as I've been talking about today, but a program that checks the number of prescriptions that are sent out statewide, and it's fairly new. And it's important for me because I have a jurisdiction that borders on New Hampshire. So as you can imagine, there have been people who perhaps get prescription drugs in some of the communities just north in Massachusetts, then go over to New Hampshire and do the same thing. So that monitoring is critical, and that's important, and that's been in effect, for a bit. In terms of the overprescription,
they identify the physician who has overprescribed?
Oh, they do, yes. And what they do now is they try to work with the Board of Registration to have that addressed, at least initially, administratively, before it becomes a criminal investigation. So that's happening now. But there's always going to be the ongoing debate between pain management and what we're trying to do on this end. And I don't think anybody wants to prohibit someone from getting the proper pain management they need. But this is just going to be, it's going to be an ongoing debate going forward, and how to regulate that and what to do. And in terms of the law enforcement part, at least in my state, the monitoring of that is currently happening. And there have been a few cases of physicians who have been charged as a result of their overprescription and their criminal activity.
Anybody else on prescription?
Yeah, there's a statewide prescription management initiative set up by the state legislature in Washington where any prescribing doctor can check to see if a person has obtained a certain amount within a previous time period. But it's a voluntary basis. You can't compel. What I would say, again, going back, you have to look at why these people are drinking to excess or smoking to excess or consuming legal or illegal drugs to excess. And part of that is mental health issues. Part of that is housing issues. If we did a much better job as a society in prenatal care, postnatal care, early education, the nurse-family partnership program, we could greatly reduce the amount of people who become dependent on chemicals.
Other questions? Jeff?
Yeah, thanks for the all panelists' comments. I'm curious, does the rise of fentanyl or other synthetic opioids complicate or change any of these strategies that you've articulated so far?
It has become the biggest dragon that I've had to slay in the last year. Just this last year, the Massachusetts legislature labeled fentanyl as an illegal drug with penalties attached. And of course, I'm seeing so many overdoses now of people having the pure fentanyl, which is killing people in droves. I have 164 deaths to date in my county, 164, and the majority of those heroin with fentanyl or fentanyl alone. So it's absolutely become a huge problem for us to deal with.
Another question here? Yes, ma'am?
Yeah, my question, and I'm not a statistician, so there's a point at which my knowledge base here gets thin. I started out as assistant district attorney, so I've got a different lean on this. But as I've talked to people around here, I knew in North Carolina that there's some issues around keeping statistics. And even within our court system, the different statistical information systems not speaking to one another all that well. But what I've noticed, and I've been talking to a lot of people since I got here, is that nationwide there is a lot of difficulty around statistics. So, for example, even statistics that the court system must keep and have kept, they're not in a form at all that can be useful for the technology and the data that we have now. And so my question has to do with whether it's CARA or other things. Is there a requirement for some uniformity around this data collection? Because especially when you start talking about financing, you've got to be able to demonstrate clearly that this is what happened, these are the results. And, to the extent, based on what I'm hearing around here, that could be a problem.
Information sharing, access to information? Anybody?
Let me talk about, there are some sort of standard data platforms that like justice agencies are encouraged to use, et cetera. Encouraged, yes, you smiled when I said that. And there are problems with the data that is collected most places because humans are involved in it. That creates some issues, right? But one of the things that motivates people is actually being able to use the data for something. And so the more that we use it, the more invested people become in it, and then the better job we do at collecting and reporting it. One of the things that I'm previewing for another session that's coming up is the White House's data-driven justice initiative, where they're looking at it's much easier to link and connect these data systems today with technology than it was in the old days when we had really hard to interface DOS systems and even proprietary systems until recently. And so now the White House is encouraging and supporting and making, they're not making the resources available, but there are resources available to do some of this data cross-match that will make decision-making more interesting. And it will also get people more invested in the data. And I think right now we're really talking about incentivizing the use of data as opposed to requiring some sort of standard thing across the country.
So on the new federal funding and resources with CARA, there are accountability provisions, data reporting, annual requirements for reporting into either HHS or DOJ the outcomes of your program. So those lanes, again, whether you're using the dollars to expand recovery support services or initiate a criminal justice medication-assisted treatment in your corrections facility, or you're doing a prosecution-led diversion initiative, data will be expected to be collected at baseline and as the program continues, and probably some longer follow-ups as well. It's not sexy to do this, but it is necessary if we're going to take it to scale, so those requirements are in the legislation. Actually, those requirements are now in the law. I have to get used to saying that. So but they will be expected. And there's going to be a lot of discussion on how to do that and what resources and supports are out there. Because some of this is going to feel pretty new, and we're going to need to figure out the best ways to accomplish that.
Let me just add a footnote to that. It's become very clear that in a lot of areas of criminal justice reform, information collection, having information available to evaluate and measure is becoming critical. And although information sharing in the justice system has typically been driven by tactical and operational needs, getting information to the cop on the street, getting information in the hands of judges when they make sentencing decisions, it's becoming very clear that information has a great deal of value in many other aspects, whether it be the evaluation of a program or even the administration of a program. So I would hope that as we look at various areas of criminal justice reform, we would remember that could be that's a significant element of any initiative, and that's to make sure you're enabling information sharing. A number of people in the room joined me for breakfast this morning to talk about information sharing, and some of you may have attended the IGIS workshop earlier today, where they talked about the information sharing playbook. I mean, this is really very important. There's a wealth of information out there. It needs to be managed correctly. It needs to be available under the right circumstances. It isn't just a matter of opening up the floodgates to all information, but it's critical. And there are a number of legal and cultural impediments to sharing information. I mean, you start talking about HIPAA restrictions on information, which probably seem to many people to be greater than they really were ever intended to be, but nonetheless, it's an obstacle. So there's a lot of work to be done in that area. So you raise a very important point. Other questions from the audience? Well, thank you. I want to again thank Connects to Share for their able live streaming of this event. And I want to thank you for your attention, and I particularly want you to join me in thanking the panel for their contribution to this workshop.